Democrats' registration is down to 25% nationally. They're kicked out of state houses across the country. Republicans have majorities. We've lost both houses of Congress. We've lost the executive branch. You think that maybe it's time to reform and think about what we're doing wrong as Democrats? I don't see that happening. I see, kind of our Senate leader talking down to people about, how we can win by appealing to suburban Republican voters. For every blue-collar, working class person we lose, we'll get 2 in the suburbs of Philadelphia. Well, you know what? That is the continuing strategy, and it doesn't work.
Right. No, it didn't work. And in fact, it wasn't in Philadelphia. They got the extra suburban voters in California, where the overage was so large that they didn't even bother to count the votes.
Meanwhile, they lost the working vote in Wisconsin, in Michigan,
Meanwhile, they went down the tubes. We had a repeat. In the year 2000, we had a completely undemocratic, anti-democratic, indefensible victory of the presidential candidate who received fewer votes. We had that in 2000. We had that in 2016. Well, that's 2 elections out of 5. So this electoral system is producing these irrational results.
And part of it is reforming our election system, getting rid of things like the national popular vote. Ranked choice voting is introduced in 12 states, including here in Connecticut. We've got to reform our system to allow people to come back in and get engaged in voting, because so many people are staying home. And you can blame it, like President Obama did, on, when 46% of people stay home. No, it's not the people, it's the system, and the fact that we don't have candidates that appeal to what the people want. Now, Bernie Sanders brought out people in 50,000 in a stadium, 13 million behind him, and he was undermined. And so part of it is, where did these people go? They go to the Green Party. The Green Party is not only a national party that is existing, it's not only in 50 states, it's in 90 countries, and it just won an election for Austrian presidency. It just had a substantial increase in votes in the Holland election, where they helped to defeat Geert Wilders, who was an extreme right-wing candidate. So it can happen here. We need a little bit of election reform. We need to bring people out, and we need to mobilize people into a third party. And that logical third party is the Green Party.
If all of the people who supported Bernie Sanders, let's do a thought experiment here. If all of the people who supported Bernie Sanders organized themselves into the Green Party, we would have a winning progressive party. Okay? We might not have as many bodies of voters at the very beginning as the institutional Democrats, but the enthusiasm gap, as was the case for Bernie Sanders, would be all ours. Okay? All of the serious progressive activists would be part of the Green Party. Now, one of the things we're going to talk about today is, why is it that there are so many people who are avid about Bernie and his issues who have a hard time getting their mind around the Green Party, even though the Green Party has been standing for 85 to 90% of those issues in ways very similar to Bernie Sanders' stance on these issues? Is it that we can only do this when we have a grandfatherly, charismatic candidate? Can we only do this on a personal basis, or are the issues important enough that we actually organize around a party? Now, my feeling is, and I'm 67 years old, I've been involved politically since I was a child. On both sides of my family, the great majority of people were active Democrats. So I basically inherited the Democratic Party as my political aegis, my political environment. Well, in the last 50 years, what I have observed is that despite all of my hopes and my various levels of involvement in the Democratic Party, 2 things that I had hoped for have not happened. I hoped that the Democratic Party would get better in the sense of getting to be more progressive. It hasn't. It's gotten less progressive. I hoped that the Democratic Party would get to be stronger. It hasn't. It's gotten weaker. It's moved farther to the right, and it's become less and less powerful at the local, state, national levels, practically every level that you can think. It's a losing party with no real progressive agenda at this point in time.
Right. And they continue to move in the direction of losing more and more people. Just simply being against Trump, it's a good thing, but it's not enough. You need to have a reason why people will vote for you. And they're not searching to do that. They're not changing the party. And instead, internal players are being moved or kept in positions of leadership, like Tom Perez undermining Keith Ellison for DNC chair, like Charles Schumer as head of the Senate Democrats, and Nancy Pelosi, who can't even kind of communicate a reason why people should vote Democratic, or who is the leader of the Democratic Party, because they so much want to push aside the Bernie movement. They so much want to marginalize millennials. And I have news for them. Millennials are the future. Millennials are not emotional, outbursting, irrational people. Millennials are people who care deeply, who showed it during this last campaign, and who need to be heard. And they can be heard as part of a third party, and that's what we need to see.
One way of looking at the difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party is to ask yourself, if the Republicans ever had an election where an important insurgent movement came up on the right during an election, would they marginalize and abandon that group in the aftermath of the election? They wouldn't. The way that they would play the game is that they would have moved over to position themselves along with that movement. They've done it many times.
Yeah.
The Democrats, on the other hand, have become so afraid of change, so afraid of real political issues, that even though there was this tremendous enthusiasm for the Sanders movement, for the Sanders campaign, for the Sanders issues, they can't figure out how to exploit it.
Right, right. So real political issues like when Democrats undermined the importation of drugs from Canada. Cory Booker and many others who've been criticized helped to sink that. That was a popular issue. Not fighting really for single-payer health care. When we had the chance under Obama, instead we ended up with a right-wing, health care plan. TPP, part of the platform. Fracking, still part of the Democratic platform. Very few Democratic establishment figures who spoke out against the Dakota Access Pipeline. All of these issues that are left untended by the Democrats are ripe for a third party to be involved in. And the Green Party is aligned with the Bernie agenda. There is even going further on certain issues like the Green New Deal is a well laid out massive infrastructure bill that will help us to create jobs and to build our infrastructure in competition with the rest of the world that's already on board with the fact that we're going to be switching to renewable energies. Why are we still having support of fracking and oil and gas? And the Democratic Party doesn't want to fight its big backers like ExxonMobil, at some point they've got to realize that the people hold potentially more sway than Goldman Sachs and ExxonMobil and the banks that provide huge millions of dollars of corporate support. And the policies and the people are what will win if they are united behind a third party like the Green Party.
You see, the American political system at the present time is not a two-party system. It's a 1.5-party system. Okay.
It's a corporate duopoly.
The Democrats, they're not a full party. They're not a full competitive national party.
Yeah.
The Republicans are organized deep down at local levels in all areas of the country. The Democrats are not.
Right.
Why are they not? Why is it that they're not organized in more than half the states? They're not organized in more than half the states. They have nothing to offer people.
Right.
Neoliberalism has hollowed out the imagination of the Democratic Party. They have nothing to offer.
Right.
They're servants of the corporations. Now, the Republicans are servants of the corporations, even more so than the Democrats. That's hard to do, but even more so than the Democrats, they're servants of the corporations. But they have a kind of what William Butler Yeats would talk about as the worst are full of a passionate intensity. Okay? The craziest and the worst and the most misguided people in this country are filled with a passionate intensity to oppose all forms of modern progress. All forms of modern progress. Gender equality, transgender equality, the progressive income tax, climate change as a reality, whether the world is flat or not, okay? There is so much reaction, so much anti-modernist feeling. People who feel threatened by the new interconnected world, and they have to fight against that.
Right.
This passionate intensity about the complaints of this new modern interconnected world has been captured by the Republicans. The Democrats can't figure out how to capture that.
Right.
And how to channel that into progressive channels. It should be channeled into progressive channels.
Right, right. Well, we almost got there with Bernie, but it didn't happen. And now, you know, as Chris Hedges likes to quote, we've essentially gotten into a state of an inverted totalitarianism, where corporate-controlled and elite political establishment figures hold so much power that voting is almost a shell of what it was and what it was intended to be, because there's so much, you know, there's the Citizens United, there's the corporate ownership of media. And our last chance to really kind of battle this is, as Frederick Douglass said, you know, what did he say? Power concedes nothing.
Without a demand.
Without a demand. It never did, and it never will.
will.
And we are in a state where, you know, we have lost so much power, and the Democratic Party is not changing. And
The Democratic Party makes no demands.
Yeah.
It's a party of conciliation, pure and simple.
Yeah. So it's a very real situation that we're in, where we can't simply divert ourselves by thinking about, oh, it's a Russian interference with the election, and Trump didn't release his tax forms, and therefore that's a big issue. And there's a big issue over here, and no. The big issue is we need a People's Party. We need to take our democratic system back. It's kind of now or never. We've got to take the momentum that we've seen in the Bernie movement and in people getting out, and not let it be put aside into a diversionary path. And there may very well be wars started to divert people as well, as we see with Korea and with Syria and Russia. But we need to take hold of our democracy, and a Green Party is there waiting for people to join it. A third party is needed. It can no longer, power will not concede without this demand. And this third party movement is the demand itself.
The Democratic Party is not viable as a vehicle for serious political advocacy. It is not. Yeah. It has been so hollowed out by the corporate contribution system that it can't take actual controversial standpoints. It can't do it. It can't even articulate them, let alone implement them. Okay.
So what are the Greens going to do about it? The Greens are this small party. They're, a bunch of environmentalists. Ralph Nader blew the election in 2000.
Not true.
And Jill Stein is against vaccines. If you watch Rachel Maddow and mainstream media, you realize that, it's really the Green Party's fault that we lost this election practically.
How did that work? This requires an even bigger lie than the Nader in 2000 lie. Okay? I mean, to say that Ralph Nader forced the 5-4 majority in the U.S. Supreme Court to rule in favor of Bush in Gore v. Bush. He must have done that. He must have come up with an amicus brief directing the U.S. Supreme Court, okay, to throw the election, because the election was decided in the Supreme Court.
So, I guess
the idea that Ralph Nader created those conditions is absolutely ridiculous.
It's the equivalent of CNN showing 45 minutes of an empty Trump podium and not showing Bernie Sanders' speech at all on Super Tuesday. And this is what we're victims of in terms of the media, and that people need to be aware of, is that you need to turn off Rachel Maddow and MSNBC. They're not the progressives they once were. And she can spend hours on and make a big thing of Donald Trump's tax forms, but she's owned essentially by Comcast, which is one of the worst corporations, the most unpopular corporations. And here we are looking for grasping at straws. There's the Young Turks, there's Democracy Now!, there's YouTubers like Jimmy Dore from the Young Turks, or Sane Progressive, who's wonderful. And they're all pointing in the right direction.
The Intercept.
And the Intercept, yes.
Which is actually pointing completely in the right direction, as far as I can tell.
It will, if you turn off mainstream media, turn on these channels, you'll learn a little bit more about what are the key issues and what's going on. Because the Russia example, and eventually if we heat up things with North Korea or Syria, these are all ways to divert people from taking power and from really exerting and continuing a people's movement. And so I'm talking to Bernie supporters, fellow Bernie supporters. You need to turn off the mainstream media. You need to look into the Green Party, because this is the party that is there waiting for you to take it over.
The propaganda against the Green Party, and there's a tremendous amount of it. Okay, considering what a small group it still is, it's amazing how much anti-Green Party propaganda is. The propaganda against the Green Party is to keep people demobilized.
Yeah.
It's deliberately aimed at people not allowing themselves to hope for a better future, for a real alternative.
Right.
There are third parties in every other country that you can think of. The dead hand of the two-party system is a uniquely United States of American phenomenon, and it is held in place to a very large extent by the power of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, people believe, oh, we can't possibly organize in a different way. Well, of course we can organize in a different way. The Republican Party was originally a third party.
Yep. Very good example. People are starting to use that example and say, they worked the magic along with Abraham Lincoln in turning this into a party that took over from where the Whigs were dying out. And here we see the Democratic Party losing almost every state house, and losing the federal government, and losing registration, and losing support. And they can't even examine themselves why we're doing that and what can we do to change, because they are in unidirectional, and it's not stopping. That train is not stopping. So the unidirectional is also going down, and we need a third party to rise up. And this is the possibility.
This is it. Obama dropped the mass movement in 2008. Now, what Bernie Sanders has to deal with is the fact that he dropped the mass movement in 2016. He had a mass movement, and we all know that he had promised the Democrats that if they allowed him to run in their primaries, and it's their primaries because he only registered, you remember, so that he could run in their primaries.
Yep.
He promised them that he wouldn't lead people out. Well, technically that was the correct and ethical thing to do. Politically, and in a larger sense, it was an absolute disaster, because he basically left us there, like the bride at the wedding where the groom skips out.
Right, and that's where we are now.
And that's progressive mass movement was left there at the altar. Okay, we were just left there, and
58% of Americans want to see a new party. It's like 80 or 90% of millennials, millions of millennials, were for Bernie. We have got to keep this going. It's in our interest. And so what do? We start a local chapter of the Shoreline Green Party here in Connecticut. That's what we did. People are starting chapters all over the country, and people are running for office. Sherry Honkala who was a vice presidential candidate, was just running for office in Pennsylvania. We are going to bring up the profile of candidates nationwide who represent the same interests that Bernie supporters are behind. People who represent a people's agenda, that represent student debt forgiveness, a Green New Deal, addressing income inequality, addressing climate change, and making our system more democratic. So you can affect change by joining a local party, forming a local party, making it of it what you will. Keep the momentum going.
We can make of the Green Party what we want to make of the Green Party. It can be a great and powerful progressive force. The Democratic Party is completely sold out. It's weakened, it's hollowed out politically, intellectually, morally. It's completely hollowed out. The Green Party has the potential to become a new place for us to stand, to rally as progressives, and to begin to fight back and win. Some people say that we should do this because we'll have an emboldening effect on the Democrats. Personally, I'm not encouraged by that idea because I don't think you'll ever embolden the Democrats, except in terms of the extent to which they forcefully put their hands out for corporate contributions. They are literally conduits of corporate contributions. This goes for the folks at the state level and so on. Malloy represents corporate interests.
So power concedes nothing without a demand. We need to be that demand.
So we're looking at a situation here where the Democratic Party would really like to bamboozle you into coming back into the fold and having your energy wasted and eventually joining the many other progressive movements that have died in the graveyard of progressive movements, which is the Democratic Party. And what we are saying is that those people who sit down and really think about it will want to take the following steps. Number one, change your party registration. Change it to green. Number two, network with your local Green Party activists. You'll find that there are people who have a remarkably high level of agreement with your views. Unlike going to Democratic Party events where you are confronted with people who think that you are from Mars, when you start to network with Green Party members, you're going to have a lot of people who are simpatico with your viewpoints.
Go to your state Green Party website. Go to the U.S. Green Party website, and you'll see what's still going on. A lot of activity in the wake of this election. Jill Stein, Jamu Baraka, still very active in garnering support and raising awareness around the country. But you'll also find the 10 key principles that are part of the platform of Greens. So you can look at that. It's basically one page of key, and you'll find it aligns very well with the Bernie platform. And you can, if you're so inclined, you can look at what's going on internationally. There are 90 countries with Greens who have a strong presence.
And it's now reached the point where it's not even political, it's spiritual and it's intellectual at the most basic level. The anti-science viewpoints that are now being expressed through the Republican Party, and which are being passively tolerated by the Democrats, are such that we could literally be plunged. This is not hysterical. This is not henny-penny stuff. We could be plunged into a new dark age by ignoring global warming.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
By ignoring basic scientific principles.
So, but then you think, oh well, the Democratic Party is the strongest to combat that. How, it's such a small Green Party, how could that combat that?
Well, let's draw some inspiration from a great progressive from earlier centuries. There was a man by the name of Galileo Galilei. You may remember him.
Yeah.
Okay. Galileo was a subversive individual who pointed out, among other things, that Copernicus's idea that the sun is probably the center of the solar system and the Earth is not the center of the solar system, that the Earth, although it's the center of biblical teachings, does not appear to be the center of the physical universe. Very subversive idea. He was under house arrest. Okay, he wasn't given any kind of grants. The EPA wouldn't fund his research. He was in bad shape. Okay, but he was right.
Yeah.
Okay, and he was one of the great intellectual lights of the modern world. He had a saying: if you give me a place to stand and a lever long enough, I can move the earth. The place to stand is outside of the Democratic Party. The place to stand is in a third party, which is already being given to us in the form of the existing Green Party. The lever long enough is the need for basic progressive changes, which were very well articulated both by Jill Stein and by Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
Give us a place to stand and a lever long enough, and we can move the earth.
It won't be easy, and it will be a challenge, but look where Bernie started. The Bernie movement started, he was at 3%. and he got to the mountaintop, and if not for some unfortunate circumstances, he would be president now.
Bernie Sanders, right issues, right candidate, wrong strategy. Inside the Democratic Party, it's got to be outside the Democratic Party. Let's stop wasting our energy lavishing it on the Democratic Party. When we use energy for a mass movement in the future, it needs to be outside of the Democratic Party, and it needs to be something that we own as individuals instead of the corporations that own the Democratic Party.
Yep.
We're done.